I banish you to the world of Pagan.
When we're children, we believe dumb things. It starts early with things like Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, and as you get older and reach adulthood, it gradually progresses to even more outlandish, fantastical notions like the war on terror, or the idea that our justice system is fair. One naive belief I had as a kid was that you could trust professionals behind a winning brand to put out a quality, or at least finished product. Just to give you one example, back in 1994, McDonald's had this contest with Sega where they were giving away something like 10,000 copies of the upcoming Sonic the Hedgehog 3. I figured that was a pretty good odds, so I sent in some entries, and sure enough, I actually won a copy.
Oh, I won.
Now, having already played Sonic 2, I rapidly noticed that the new game had considerably less content than the previous one. It actually had about half the levels of the second game. What I didn't know at the time is that the developers were rushing to finish the game and essentially released it way too early. They had planned to release what would essentially be the full version of the game later that year in what would be called Sonic & Knuckles. So essentially, in order to get the full Sonic 3 experience, you had to buy a different game, and as I was poor, I never got to play the full game until years later when I discovered emulation. So yeah, fuck you, Sega. Nowadays in gaming, even console gaming, it's no longer shocking to learn that a game was released too early or just plain broken. Sometimes it seems the more hype a game receives during development, the more likely it is to be released with tons of bugs requiring massive updates. Of course, when I say that, I'm not referring to any specific games. I don't want to single anyone out. I'm just saying this is a thing that happens sometimes. These days, when a game is released broken, we hear about it. Man, do we hear about it. Videos go up on YouTube showing enemies or NPCs glitching out. Comment sections fill up with everything from long rants about bugs to death threats and conspiracy theories about the devs. Gaming publications publish articles about what went wrong, hopefully with explanations as to how it happened. But in the days of sparse internet access or no internet access, the ordinary gamer, especially kids, were totally deprived of that context. This could lead to a belief that if a game were unusually hard or unfair, the player was at fault. Sort of like a self-inflicted get good, if you will. Going back to my Sonic 3 analogy, at that age I never would have imagined that one of the big two video game companies of the era would skimp on a sequel to their flagship property, the series that had been their mascot since the beginning of the 90s. But of course that game was just incomplete, not broken. My encounter with the game that was both unfinished and horribly broken would take place in 1995. On one hand, it was insanely frustrating, but on the other, it was the first RPG I'd ever seriously played and in fact beat, broken as it was. Old school gamers can readily recall the Ultima series. I'd become familiar with it from early PC game magazines, although it did have ports on the NES and later Game Boy. I didn't really pay attention to it because I wasn't into role-playing games at the time, but I understood that Ultima was a major title in the RPG genre. In fact, it was one of the series responsible for bringing RPGs out of the realm of pen and paper and into the medium of computer games in the first place. Most of the games cast the player as the Avatar and take place in a world called Britannia. Now again, I wasn't an RPG fan, so I really didn't pay much attention to the series, but one day, circa 1994, I saw the cover art for the 8th game in the series. Yeah, we should probably talk about this. So, some of you are already aware of something called the Satanic Panic, a sort of bizarre wave of hysteria that spread across the US from the late 70s till about the end of the 80s. While much of the panic is associated with religious fundamentalist preachers, some of whom made speaking careers based on fabricated claims of being former members of satanic witches' covens, the beliefs were also fueled by the mainstream media, which reported on the claims as though there might be something to them. Like I said, most of this died out by the end of the 80s, but if you were brought up in a fiercely religious environment like I was, the Satanic Panic lasted a bit longer. So when a friend just happened to have the game and we were bored, I was intrigued enough to start playing it, but it was the kind of game I could only play when home alone. I don't know what it was about the game I was really attracted to. It was colorful and well animated for its time, and the story and the instruction manual seemed pretty interesting. Also, a part of me felt like I should at least try to play an RPG, and since Ultima was so well known, it seemed like a good place as any to start. When it came to games in those days, I also had to make do with what I could get. I can understand why Ultima fans would have been disappointed with Ultima 8 Pagan, as it deviated from the setting in Britannia they were used to, but for someone with no prior knowledge of the story, the new world of Pagan was very digestible. In Ultima 8, a supernatural antagonist from the previous game called the Guardian drops your avatar into a completely different world where no one's ever heard of him. Meanwhile, he plans to conquer Britannia and later Earth. So the avatar's task is pretty straightforward: find a way home. As my friends and I installed the games on our respective PCs and attempted to play through it, we soon realized the task ahead would be far more difficult than we had anticipated. First of all, there's getting used to the controls and movement. As you can already see, Ultima 8 is an isometric game, and you may be tempted to draw parallels with something more familiar like Diablo. Don't. This game's controls suck. Depending on where your mouse cursor is relative to your character, you can take baby steps, walk normally, or run, but be prepared to get caught on a lot of doorways as you try to navigate structures. Your player can also jump, which is used for climbing up ledges and platforming. Oh yes, we need to talk about the platforming in Ultima 8. A large section of the game entails jumping across large bodies of water on little stone platforms, some of which periodically sink and resurface. In the early version we were initially playing, pretty much every jump was a roll of the dice as to whether you'd land on the platform you were trying to jump to. Even worse, one section of the game had platforms that would move back and forth. A later patch fixed it so the moving platforms became stationary, which strongly implies the devs knew the original game was way too hard. But my first playthrough was with the original Ultra Nightmare version. Now you may be thinking, sure, that sucks, but couldn't you just save before each jump? Yeah, about that. To this day, I'll never understand why, but Ultima 8 took an unusually long time to both save and load games. I'd say it took at least a minute to do either on my original PC, which was a very early Pentium, and my friend started out playing it on a 386. Yeah, oof. Maybe ask your parents or an older nerd somewhere exactly what a 386 is. Combat was also clunky as hell. In order to fight, you have to enter combat mode with the C key, and then you can strike with your weapon or kick, which I always found utterly useless. In the early game, pretty much anything could beat you in a fight, but on the plus side, you could pretty much run away from virtually any enemy in the game. If you want to stand any chance at all, you're going to need decent weapons and equipment. And this was another obstacle in the early game for us. Very early in the game, you encounter this room of what seems like very useful armor and weapons, but if you try to take any of them, the town sorcerer Baron shows up and blasts the avatar into pieces. The steepest learning curve, however, was just figuring out where to go and what to do. My understanding of RPGs at the time was that you were supposed to talk to people who would give you quests, and yet we were running around talking to everyone we could find and no one was asking us to do anything or really advancing the plot in any way we could see. The closest thing we found to an actual quest was an optional side quest where you find this enchanted mace called the Slayer. It's arguably the second best weapon in the entire game and you get it virtually from the start, but doing so doesn't advance the plot in any way. Because my friend and I both had the game installed on our respective computers, we'd each play on our own and then share what we found. My friend opened up a big development by finding this character Mithrin, but while he grants you all sorts of new abilities and is crucial for beating the game later, at that point he still doesn't give you any quests, nor does he get the ball rolling story-wise. As it turns out, yours truly was the first to actually find the first quest and get us on the path to actually beating the game. It all begins with what starts off as a fetch quest to get a ceremonial dagger for the necromancers, but soon after that you manage to overthrow the local ruler and then become the necromancer's apprentice. While the sequence of events gets rolling from there were still points in the game where you find yourself wondering what you're supposed to do next. Compounding that problem was the fact that we were using an early version of the game which had a lot of broken or incomplete quests. So, for example, once you've finished nearly everything you have to do for the necromancers, you're sent on this pilgrimage to the birthplace of the first necromancer, who's known as Morian's. Well, guess what? In the version we had at the time, Morian's birthplace wasn't even programmed into the game. You go looking for it and eventually end up bumbling your way into this other area where you eventually get your first info about how to get out of Pagan and get back home. But you never find the birthplace of Morian's you were looking for in the first place. Later on they patched this by making a little sparkly effect above this altar, and a nearby sign on the wall says, "Birthplace of Morian's." Good save, guys. Now, at some point you might wonder why we kept playing through a game that was so obtuse, clunky, and flat out broken. Well, getting back to what I said earlier in the video, in those days we often didn't know what was going on behind the scenes in terms of game development. We didn't know, for example, that Ultima 8 was basically rushed out the door at least 3 months early. We didn't know about how there had been a planned expansion pack that got cancelled, which led to a hilarious situation involving a big locked door with no key to unlock it. Seriously, every time I thought I'd found the key and I was stuck, I'd come back to this one place and try it, and of course it never worked. We thought that everything that was in the game was just what the devs had planned, so who are we to complain? For me, playing my first role-playing game, it felt like a personal challenge, and rise to that challenge I did, even if I often wondered if I was doing things the right way. But in all fairness, I found the art style and especially the story to be very compelling. The world of Pagan has a rich history told via the game's manuals and books and scrolls found in the game world. Basically, the world started out as this normal, fertile land where the original inhabitants, called Zelens, worship gods that were personifications of emotions. The Guardian contacts certain people who become prophets and start preaching against the ancient religion in favor of a new faith based around the worship of elemental titans. Religious war breaks out, and eventually the titans show up and wreck the Zelens' shit. But in the process, they pretty much destroy all the known world save for one volcanic island called Morgalen. And what's worse is they basically start making life hell for everyone left over. Lithos, Titan of Earth, the Mountain King, is causing quakes left and right. Hydros, the Lurker, Titan of Water, is causing storms and floods, forever blotting out the sun. Pyros, the Fire Titan, is stoking volcanoes and Pompeying everyone in sight. And finally, Stratos, the Titan of Wind, is, blowing everyone. Gradually, certain pagans came to interact with and make pacts with the four titans, typically receiving those titans' magical powers as well. This is reflected in the different schools of magic you see in the game. For Lithos, necromancy, Hydros, tempestry, Stratos, thurgy, and Pyros, sorcery. Throughout the game, you'll learn all of these except Tempestry. The devs didn't have time to set it up, so in the game it's a hereditary power and you don't have it. You also get to learn a fifth type of magic called Thaumaturgy, which tends to be the most useful throughout the game and essential for completing it. Each magic system you use in the game is very different, but what most of them have in common is being incredibly inconvenient to use. I can really appreciate how the game requires you to do things like gather reagents and perform rituals in order to create spells. Basically what you might call a hard magic system. But the problem is it's just such a clunky interface. If you're in the middle of combat, you're extremely unlikely to be able to open your inventory, click on a prepared spell, and use it before you get whacked. And if you're fighting an enemy that can't kill you in that time, there's really no reason to be using magic at all. I'm not saying none of the spells do cool things, but a lot of them are just useless or at best unnecessary, so most of the time the only magic you really need are those you cast by using scrolls or the spells that are required to accomplish quests and advance the plot. What's interesting about Ultima 8's progression is that it can be non-linear at times, but that's usually because it's broken rather than by design. And because it's so wonky, there are a lot of times when you take a pivotal action that advances the plot, but you're left wondering if you were meant to do that or if you just accidentally cheated somehow. Ultimately, the game was a slog, especially because your view is limited and you can't just pull up a map to see where you are or what you're trying to do. On the plus side, however, the game did have an early version of fast travel, and although enemies can easily kill you through most of the game, it's pretty easy to heal yourself just by resting. The weapons are kind of funny because even though there are many enchanted weapons throughout the game, pretty much all but 2 weapons totally suck. The only weapon I found to be any good was the one you find on the side quest called the Slayer. And then late in the game you get something called the Flame Sting, which is essentially like a BFG 9000 with infinite ammo. It's a sword that ignites a fire under your enemy's feet every time you swing it, thus doing massive damage. And this is probably the best part to start talking about all the weird shit that happens in this game. See, for all its faults, the game was entertaining because of how unpredictable it could be. And this could go both ways. Sometimes it meant getting killed for the weirdest reason, but other times you could accidentally accomplish something you never expected was possible. And other times it was just entertaining to screw around with the physics, enemies, or NPCs. Even on this most recent playthrough, I figured out a way to get in a fight with the Tempest Mordea without her being able to kill me. Speaking of Mordea, this isn't even a bug, but check out the awesome security in her palace. Her guards just stand there while you literally walk into her bedchambers. Another fun thing to do is fill your inventory with firebombs and light them all at once. When the avatar explodes, the game spawns a set of blown up body parts, but it will do this for literally every bomb that detonates, making it look like a Mortal Kombat 3 fatality. You can also disable something called speed limiting in the options menu, which allows the avatar to enter turbo mode. Back in the day, one enterprising gamer compiled a long list of ways you could be a dick to the NPCs and sometimes effectively break the game. It really did give you a great deal of leeway to experiment, and you've got to give the devs credit for that. And although it's not a bug, I should mention that as young teenagers, my friends and I had a lot of banal laughs about this blacksmith character who appears to be jerking it every time he's talking to you. Don't judge us. This was a time when we considered Beavis and Butthead to be the zenith of comedy.
What's your problem, dumbass?
As far as I can remember, I played through the whole game twice, and the second time was a bit easier because I've been using the improved patch version. It was confusing and frustrating at first, but that made it much more satisfying anytime we discovered how to solve a certain quest, or even just found a new location we missed. By the summer of 1996, I'd pretty much forgotten about the game, mainly because this other game came out then.
Damn, those alien bastards are gonna pay for shooting up my ride.
But for all its faults, it was a real challenging and stimulating game, and it makes you appreciate having the modern internet where you can easily go on YouTube and look up a complete walkthrough of virtually any game, including this one, by the way. Ultima 9, Ascension, wouldn't release until nearly 6 years later in 1999, and pretty much flopped. I heard it disappointed die-hard Ultima fans even more than Ultima 8 Pagan did. On the other hand, Ultima Online, one of the first MMOs, released in 1997, and as I understand it still lives on in some form today. It's strange to think about why broken, unfinished games didn't seem as bad or disappointing back then as they do in our modern era. Personally, I think a large part of it has to do with the fact that games were rapidly evolving at the time, so even a mediocre game could look far better in comparison with its predecessors. In terms of graphics, animation, and sound, Ultima 8 was pretty impressive for its time. Keep in mind, this game launched only about a year after PCs were really starting to be taken seriously as competition for consoles. Released only a year earlier than Pagan, Doom blew every console then in existence out of the water, but it wasn't representative of most PC games of the era. Duke Nukem 2 came out the same year as Doom, and it looked like this. Another factor, and I think perhaps the most important, was the lack of hype compared to today. I had zero interest in games like No Man's Sky or Cyberpunk 2077, but I was made aware of them well before their releases because you simply couldn't not know about them. Gaming is just more mainstream now, and companies are spending far more money making and marketing their games. For me, Ultima was just a series I knew existed from ads and magazines, and in general, the capacity to overhype games just wasn't really there yet. A lot of early gaming magazines might feature an upcoming game on the cover, but these were often sequels to well-proven titles like Street Fighter II or Mortal Kombat. And lastly, like I said in the beginning, part of it was just the naivete of youth. Trusting that the developers knew exactly what they were doing, and thus believing that if you were having problems with the game, it was probably your own fault. But if you know anything about me, it's that I hate unrealistic depictions of the past and phony nostalgia. That's why I have to say, looking back now, especially after having had to play the game again to get my own footage for this video, Ultima 8 Pagan, well, really sucks. It's not a matter of challenge or unfairness, but rather it's just extremely inconvenient to play. Your character is constantly getting blocked by the tiniest objects or getting stuck in doorways just for starters. Just look at this. Here's my player character literally blocked by a piece of paper on the floor. He can't even jump over it. Combat is boring and largely optional. Magic is inconvenient to use and or underwhelming. And even the most basic tasks are complicated by the fact that your clicking in this game must be pixel perfect in many cases. Oh, and apart from all the bugs, there are so many things in this game that are complete red herrings. You'll die and reload several times to get across something and reach some chest, only to open it and find literally nothing of value in it. Playing this again was as much a slog now as it was back then. Nonetheless, it was my first RPG, and like the Prince song goes, they say the first time ain't the greatest. I never did become a huge RPG fan, but I did get into the Final Fantasy series some years later, and despite its flaws, such as the glorification of child soldiers and shit like this, it was nice to play RPGs that actually had a convenient control scheme. If I had to say the biggest positive takeaway I got from Ultima 8 Pagan, it would be the story and the world. But that's about it. I'm sorry, but I really tried to like this game. I tried to feel that nostalgia trip, and I just couldn't do it. I think what drove me on as a kid was just the novelty of it and a sense of discovery and satisfaction in overcoming the game's many obstacles. From what I've read over the years, Ultima 8 Pagan managed to gather a cult following, and there have been rumors about remakes and possibly even building the cancelled Lost Vale expansion. If the fans ever manage to fix Pagan, well, more power to them. I might even give it a try. But till then, I'm leaving Ultima 8 Pagan where it belongs, in the past. If you want to roll the dice and take a shot at it, check it out on Good Old Games. It'll set you back only about $2. Why not?
You're a stupid dumbass.
Well, everyone, I hope you enjoyed that quest down memory lane. If you liked the video, please click like and subscribe, and check out the description below for a link to my Patreon page where you could support my work. Remember, I played through half of this incredibly shitty, inconvenient game just for your entertainment. So I'll leave you with that guilt trip, and I'll see you next time.